public goods and externalities. In this chapter, the topics we deal with include public goods. So we'll talk about what public goods are and distinguish them from private goods. And then we'll talk about externalities. We'll also talk about briefly discuss some solutions to externalities. What options does government have when trying to or attempting to respond to externalities on both the negative and positive side. Okay, so public goods. So in the benchmark model, we made a whole bunch of assumptions, and we had our two individuals, A and B, who are also the producers, or perhaps the firms in the economy. These two individuals were producing two goods, X and Y, and these goods were then traded between themselves. Now, when we're going a little bit deeper, moving away from the simple model and providing a more accurate description of the types of goods that we observe in the real world, right, in the goods market. Now, the benchmark model is not exactly an accurate description of the real world goods market. Of course not, based on all the assumptions that we make, including the nature of the goods being traded. Now, just to recap, Pareto efficient production requires consumers to reveal their preferences. Furthermore, they are incentivized to reveal their preferences through the price mechanism. So in the standard neoclassical model, individuals have a demand schedule, and that demand schedule effectively reveals their preferences for a particular good, right? Now, this may occur in the market for private goods with the following properties. There's rivalry in consumption and there's excludability. So what do these two things mean? Rivalry in consumption, these are properties of the goods of the goods being traded in the goods market. Rivalry in consumption implies divisibility among individuals. So most goods that are consumed or traded in the goods market have this property, the rivalrous, or there is rivalry in consumption of these goods. And your cars, for instance, right? A car can be assigned to a particular individual in the market. If you're in the market for a car and you purchase a car, you then have the rights, the sole right to the use of that car, right? It is now yours, and anyone else trying to make use of that car without your consent will not be allowed to do so, and you have recourse to the judicial system to ensure that your rights to that good that you purchased is upheld. And that's all that we mean by rivalry in consumption. One individual is assigned, when someone purchases a good, that individual is assigned the rights to the use of that good. And that right can be enforced, okay? It's possible to enforce that right. Excludability means that only those in the market get to access the goods, right? Only those who are willing to pay, those who have a demand schedule, who reveal their preferences by their willingness to pay for something, are allowed to consume the good. Again, this applies to most goods that we consume in our day-to-day lives. Airtime is a good example. For you to make use of the cell phone networks, you need to buy airtime, whether it's prepaid or postpaid. Okay. So these two properties are important in the provision of private goods. They are important because they force individuals to reveal their preferences, right, by their willingness to pay the equilibrium price for a given good or service. Right. Now, there are three types of non-private goods, and we can use these properties that we just outlined to discuss these types of non-private goods, the three types of non-private goods. Two of these types are what we call mixed. So in the first case, a mixed good exhibits rivalry in consumption, but it does not exhibit excludability. So again, rivalry in consumption implies that if you provide access to the good to one person, you can restrict access to someone else. And the textbook, I think they give the example of a very busy inner city street. So no one is excluded from using a road if you are a driver. No one is excluded from using a public road. However, if there is dense traffic, there is to a degree rivalry in the consumption of that good, right? Because the more traffic there is, the slower the traffic will move. An individual is able to, if we go back to this, to our definition of the year, rivalry and consumption was divisibility among individuals. So you can assign one good to one person. In other words, one person gets the right to use that particular good or service at that time, but you cannot exclude anyone from using that good or service. Then you have mixed good that exhibits excludability, but not rivalry. So you can preclude people from accessing the good, those who are not willing to pay for it, but those who are can access the supply is equal to all of them of this particular good. So here the example I think in the textbook is that of a toll road. So you can exclude people from using a toll road, although as we see in Joburg, even that is difficult sometimes. Well, in an extreme case, what Joburg could have done was, instead of having this sophisticated technological system that requires tags and these sort of virtual gates that anyone can pass through, they could have physical gates at the toll road, right, like they do at the tunnels, etc. And at some parts of the highways. So you have toll roads that restricts access, so that is excludability, but anyone who is inside of those gates has the same supply, right? They supply they drive on the same road, and there's no rivalry and consumption in that case, unless again unless the traffic becomes very dense. And finally, there's the pure public good, and this is the one we are most interested in, which exhibits neither rivalry nor excludability. So no one can be excluded from accessing the good or consuming the good or service, and there is no rivalry in the consumption. It's not divisible, right? You cannot assign the right to you can't discretize the good or service. And the example I think given here in the textbook is that of street lighting, where anyone can access street lights. Anyone can go and walk in the street, is lit up by street lights, and street lights are not divisible among households. You can't allocate a set number of photons to a particular individual based on how much they paid to have access to the street lights. And it's difficult to exclude people from access to the street lights to begin with. Another example given here, usually, and this is usually the canonical case, is defense, right? National defense. Everyone benefits from national defense. You can't exclude anyone based on that, really. And it's also non-rivalness, right? I don't have a set allocation of national defense that I've paid for, right? Okay, so the poor public goods are indivisible. They cannot be split into units, and so it's difficult to assign rights to a discrete volume of the good or service. Further, the consumption of a pure public good by a given individual does not reduce available consumption for other individuals, right? So if I'm walking on a path that is lit with street lights, it doesn't reduce the availability for someone else to walk that path as well. All right. So here's some examples of non-rival goods. So radio broadcasting or television broadcasting. And again, like I said, some of these examples will seem somewhat unsatisfying, because these days you can restrict access to these things, right? DSTV is a TV broadcaster. You only get to access DSTV if you pay for it, at least legally, right? So you only get to legally access DSTV if you pay for it. And that's because technology has advanced and people can be excluded from receiving certain signals and decoding them so that they can enjoy the programming sent out via those signals. Other non-rival goods are software. So open source software, of course, is both non-rival and non-excludable, right? No one is excluded from using Linux, for instance. But some software, while non-rival, is excludable, right? So some of you are running Windows machines. You have to buy a license to use that software, right? Or if you're using the Microsoft Suite, for instance, again, you need a license to use that software. All right, now one of the important implications of a non-rival good, that is one that is not divisible, is that it implies zero marginal cost, right? If you want to run a Linux, the Linux OS, let's say Ubuntu, you want to run Ubuntu on your PC, it costs the Linux developers nothing, right? When you download the software and you run it on your computer. But well, for that matter, it costs Microsoft nothing if you run Windows on your computer. Technically, they do have to support the software via updates, etc. But in the main, when you download the software and you install it on your computer, it doesn't cost them anything, right? And the implication there is that there's zero marginal cost. Now, if you think about the neoclassical framework that we talked about in chapter 2, marginal cost equals marginal utility and marginal cost equals price, right? Now, if marginal cost equals zero, as is the case with a non-rival good, it suggests that it is Pareto inefficient to restrict anyone from access to that good, right? Because the marginal cost is zero, and therefore the price should, in theory, in the neoclassical framework, suggest that the price should be zero, right? And that's because no one's welfare is reduced due to the additional consumer. So if you download Linux software, you're not reducing the availability of that software for anyone else, right? Because it is non-rival. So if you tune into a radio station and you enjoy whatever radio station, Metro FM, you're not reducing someone else's ability. You're not reducing the ability of Metro FM to someone else, again, because it's non-rival. Okay. Non-excludability, such a, an example here would be national defense again, or street lighting. And here you cannot exclude individuals from consuming the goods. So this is not like the STB. So this would be something like, say, radio broadcasting, where you just can't exclude anyone from setting up an antenna and receiving the signals that are being sent out over the radio. Okay, there are some caveats to these concepts that I've now introduced. These concepts being the idea of a pure public good and then mixed goods. And those caveats are that we rarely observe them, especially in modern day, it's somewhat plausible to imagine that it would be possible to just completely eliminate this idea of pure public goods, right? But it may be possible to restrict people's access or to sort of force people to pay for things. And the toll roads in Johannesburg are an example of that, right? So they're using modern technology rather than having physical gates that restrict people's access to a portion of the road. They have these virtual gates that read tags that are installed into cars, and that way they can then force people to pay for the roads. Now, as with anything that the government does, what's sort of lying behind this ability of government to force people to pay for things, for instance, to force people to pay their taxes, is the threat of violence. The idea of the nation state is that the state is formed and what it does is monopolize violence. In other words, the state is the only actor in society that can legitimately enact violence on citizens of a given nation state. So the threat is there that if you don't pay for things, the state can come in and throw you in jail. Okay, so let's talk about how we traditionally think of the market for private goods versus the market for public goods. So the graph here shows the market for some private good I think they use CDs as an example, another antiquated example in the textbook. So you have two individuals, I think it's B and J, forget their names, it might be Bongi and Jenner, let's say. And this graph shows their respective demand curves for a private good, which is both excludable and rivalrous. So here, DB is Bongi's demand curve for this good, and then DJ is Jenner's demand curve for this good. Now, in a traditional, given that this is a private good that exhibits both excludability and rivalness or rivalry, the traditional way to get to market demand is to just sum their individual demand curves, right? So here, this line DB is effectively Bongi's demand schedule for CDs, and the line to the right of that, DJ, or Jenner's demand curve, is effectively her demand schedule for CDs. That's the price she's willing to pay at each quantity. And to get to the market demand, assuming that the entire market comprises these two individuals, you sum horizontally, right? So the market demand curve is then given by D, B plus J, Bongi plus Jenner. So these are the only two individuals in the market, therefore this is the market demand curve. And this one has a bit of a kink because the individual demand curves don't intersect the price axis at the same point, right? So the demand curve is given by the rightmost line, including that kinked area over there. And then you have the market supply curve, and the intersection of market demand and market supply give you the equilibrium price and quantity over here. It's given by price PE, quantity QE. Okay, so the main point to highlight here is that demand is given, market demand is found by horizontally summing the individual demand curves, okay? And this is possible because these guys, Bongi and Jenner, are forced to reveal their preferences for CDs, right? If Bongi wants a CD, he has to pay for it, likewise Jenner. And when Bongi purchases a CD, and maybe CDs are not the best example because they're relatively cheap to copy. But when Bongi purchases a item, a physical CD, that physical CD is now his, and he has exclusive rights to that product. Jenner can't access that same CD unless they're friends or whatever. So they have to reveal their preferences by paying for these things. Furthermore, they are price takers, right? They cannot influence the price of the CDs, right? And of course, that assumption applies when there are lots of buyers and lots of sellers. You can't then individually, they cannot influence the equilibrium price that holds in the market. Okay. All right. Now, looking at the market for public goods, things are a bit different. You have a market for an indivisible public good that is also non-excludable or non-rival. And here we have the demand curves for, again, Bongi and Jenner, given by DB and DJ. In this case, they are somewhat parallel. But what you notice is that Bongi has a lower sort of willingness to pay for street lighting, say. Let's use that as the example, as the public good here, than is the case for Jenner. Now, over here, in the private good case, these Bongi and Jenner were price takers because they couldn't influence the market. What's interesting, what's different here is that they are now quantity takers. So here we don't sum the individual demand curves horizontally to attain the market demand, because Bongi and Jenner don't have to pay for this good, right? They are not forced to reveal their preference by being asked to pay for street lighting. Because again, if you have street lighting at night, that's just going to be on every night, no matter what. Then both Bongi and Jenner can use the good or the service, and without having to reveal their preferences to pay for that. So In essence, these demand curves given here are what are called pseudo demand curves. You can see the word pseudo there in the first bullet, demand curves, because the demand schedules are not explicit. They are not forced to reveal the demand schedules by the price mechanism, as is the case for the private good that exhibits both excludability and rivalry in consumption. Okay, so they are quantity takers, not price takers, since the full supply of the good is always available to both of them, right? The supply curve doesn't change no matter what. So market demand is here determined by the vertical summation of the respective demand curves rather than the horizontal summation. And these curves, like in the case of the private good, reflect their marginal utility, right? So to find the equilibrium price, we look at the marginal utility. We consider the utilities rather than the willingness to pay. So a key implication here is that B&J are price adjusters in essence. So in this case, they are quantity adjusters, right? They will adjust the quantity that they consume based on the price that they are expected to pay, based on the equilibrium price. But in this case, Bongi and Jenner are they are price adjusters. Okay, they can adjust the price that they are willing to pay for a given good or service, for a public good specifically or service, and that has several implications for the provision of public goods, right? So in the public good case, the optimal pricing is given by the summation of individuals' prices. Okay, and that is shown in this equation over here. Here you have the price for good X, if good X is a public good, is the summation of the utilities of Bongi and Jenner, and that in turn should equal the marginal cost if we impose the neoclassical framework, right, for the provision of a public good. However, it should be noted that since individuals don't reveal the true preferences, this value is indeterminate, right? Again, because of the properties of non-excludability and non-rivalry in the provision of public goods or in the consumption of public goods, they're not forced to reveal their preferences. So these quantities, marginal utilities, are not reflected as would be the case with a standard private good that is both rivalrous and excludable. Okay, so this table just summarizes the distinctions between public and private goods. So this is a useful shorthand for you to just have a look at if you want to know the main distinctions between these two. So I won't talk to this any further. Just note the equilibrium conditions here. In the case of private good, you simply have that the individual's marginal utility equals the marginal cost. In the case of the provision, for the firm, you have price equals marginal cost, right? And therefore price also equals marginal utility. Over here, you have to sum over individual utilities to get marginal cost. Also, you have to sum over the prices that individuals are willing to pay to get marginal cost. Okay. All right, so who should supply public goods? So now, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that the zero marginal cost implies in the neoclassical framework that the price should be zero, right? Furthermore, zero marginal cost implies that admitting another user to a given service or good, given that it is costless, there's no cost to it, it is Pareto inefficient to exclude someone from the consumption of a good or service, right? A public good or service. And that makes it very difficult for firms to provide these goods or services because they adhere to the principle of price equals marginal cost in a neoclassical framework, that is. So the private provision is not quite feasible since any price higher than zero is Pareto inefficient, right? And remember what we mean by Pareto efficiency. What we mean is that society is as well off, welfare of society is maximized, right, by the provision of goods and services and by the trade in the markets for those goods and services. Okay, so what in essence, public goods sort of give rise to this scenario where you can have Pareto inefficiency if you exclude anyone from a public good, right? So you can make people better off. I mean, the example is very simple. If it's costless to provide or if the cost of admitting another user of street lighting is zero, it doesn't make sense to exclude that person from using the street lighting, right? To the extent that they get some utility from doing so. So any individual can be made better off by using the street lighting at zero cost. So excluding someone from that is Pareto inefficient. So the market cannot determine an equilibrium price in markets for pure public goods. Furthermore, non-excludability incentivizes free riding. This is the idea that if you cannot be excluded and someone else is willing to pay for the good, then you effectively have an incentive to misrepresent your willingness to pay for the good or service. And doing so is what constitutes free riding. You want a free ride on someone else's willingness to pay for a good or service. And in the case of pure public goods, the incentive is there to do so. Now, government can improve on market outcomes for pure public goods with respect if they should provide them. Coming back to this idea of government being able to legitimately force people to give it money, right, through the threat of violence. And by threat of violence, I mean throwing you in jail. And given that it has that right, government can force people to pay for public goods and services. So government can cover the cost of providing goods and services via taxes. It can do so through the more sort of traditional way. So, I mean, governments can close parks, etc. In some cases, it uses licenses, but government can also get people to pay for goods and services, for public goods and services via the tax system. So taxes eliminates the free rider problem and incentivizes individuals to reveal their preferences through the voting mechanism. So if you don't like whatever the ruling party in your municipality is, if you don't like how much they're charging for electricity, for the provision of electricity or water or whatever service, you can just vote them out, vote for a different political party that promises to make these things cheaper or more efficient or whatever. All right. Now, an important point here is that although you can have the state come in and provide public goods like national defense, like street lighting, etc., it need not be the case that government actually produces these things, right? And in fact, it's not the case that government produces much of anything, to be honest. Government just provides the financing for these goods, right? So government purchases streetlights and has them installed by private companies, but pays for that via the taxes that we pay. Okay. So although we say that government is providing the good, what we effectively mean is government is simply financing the provision of these goods and services. Okay. Now there's also the idea of mixed or omitted goods, and these are usually goods that can, in theory, be provided privately, mixed goods that is, and we talked about the two types of mixed goods, but very often mixed goods are also omitted goods, and the idea of omitted goods are goods that have some sort of positive externality in their consumption, and therefore here is a different reason for government to come in and provide the good. So the idea of omitted goods is that there is some positive externality, or it's just not sort of deemed morally or politically feasible to exclude people to explicitly exclude people from these goods. And the obvious examples here are health and education, right? So in a neoclassical framework, if someone does not have the means to pay for healthcare services, they are simply excluded from the market, right? They're just not going to get access to healthcare. Likewise with education. And these goods confer positive externalities on society. If you have a healthy individuals, have implications for society at large, a healthier population that is, and a more highly educated population has positive externalities for the population at large. In fact, that's going to be the topic of the next section of this chapter, externalities. Right, so again, this is not an idea that's entirely new to you, but we're going to look at this idea in terms of the neoclassical framework. So you have two types of externalities that can be negative or positive. Negative externalities when the actions of an individual or producer or consumer, an individual producer or consumer imposes costs on another party for which he or she is not compensated, while a positive externality is when the actions of an individual producer or consumer has benefits for another party, but doesn't receive compensation for those external benefits. Now, external effects sort of drive a wedge between the private costs and benefits, private costs or benefits of either the production or consumption of a given good, and the social costs or benefits associated with the production or consumption of those goods. So social costs, in the presence of an externality, social costs equal private costs plus some external costs, right, that are not accounted for in the price. So this again is a table that just gives you a summary of this idea of positive versus negative externalities. So you can have a positive externality in both production and consumption. In the case of a positive externality in production, you have the marginal external cost is less than zero, and the marginal social cost is less than the marginal private cost. In the case of a negative production externality, the marginal external cost is positive, and the marginal social cost is larger than the marginal private cost. Right? The private cost of production is less than the social cost. There's some negative externality, and of course the obvious case here is pollution, right? In the case of consumption, a positive externality in consumption is when the marginal external benefit is positive, and that is because the social benefit is larger than the private benefit of consumption. And these cases, the top right case here, negative production externality, and the bottom left case, the positive consumption externality, are the two cases that we will talk about, because these are the most relevant sort of instances of externalities. But you can also think of a negative consumption externality, which is where the marginal external benefit is negative, and the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal private benefit. One example you can think of here might be the consumption of illicit drugs, or the consumption of even alcohol and tobacco, right? So the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal private benefit. So the person who consumes alcohol might get some utility from that activity, but in society at large, the consumption of alcohol as costs, in other words, the benefits are less than the some utility of those individuals who enjoy the consumption of alcohol. And obviously that is because of some of the externalities associated with alcohol consumption, like increased violence, interpersonal violence, domestic abuse, etc., and road accidents and all that sort of thing. Okay, so looking at this idea of externality in our neoclassical framework, here we have a demand and supply curve. So this is the market demand, market supply for a good that has a negative production externality. So the externality here is on the supply side. Initially, we have market demand given by this downward sloping D line here. So here demand equals the marginal social benefit of consuming this particular good. And initially we have the supply curve given by this line SP, which equals the marginal private cost of the production of this good. Equilibrium price is given by price PO, and equilibrium quantity supply is given by QO. And the equilibrium point here is the intersection EO. Okay? Now, if this particular good, let's say it's we can use mining as an example, or even the provision of electricity using coal-fired power stations, which produces a lot of pollution. In such instances, there might be a cost to the production of the good, electricity, say, that exceeds the private cost, right, of the production. So you can think of the social cost, and this would be manifest in air pollution of surrounding areas, and that pollution is not taken into account in the private supply curve here, the marginal private cost of the production. Now you can imagine that there is a supply curve that does take into account those costs, and that supply curve lies above the private supply curve. We call that the social supply curve, and that gives us the marginal social costs of production. Now, if you consider the intersection of SS, the supply curve, social supply curve that internalizes the cost of the externality, you notice that here the price goes up. So it goes up from PO to P1. And of course, the equilibrium price and quantity are now given by the intersection of SS and D, okay, at point E1. So the price goes up from PO to P1, and the quantity supplied goes down from QO to Q1. So now external cost, which was given previously by the area K, F, EO, so this shaded area plus this entire area between the two supply curves, that is SP and SS, that was previously that was not accounted for in the market, right? That's the external cost that was unaccounted for in this market. Now, the external cost firstly is reduced, right? And it's reduced by this shaded gray area. So that is completely eliminated now, that external cost, the area E1, F, EOJ. Furthermore, the cost K, E1J is now internalized. So this is the case of the negative production externality. Now, if we consider the case of a positive consumption externality, here we have two different demand curves in this case. So we have one supply curve, and here we have a private demand curve given by the lower line, dP, and we have a social demand curve given by ds. Again, dP now equals the marginal private benefit. ds now equals the marginal social benefit of consumption of a given good, which has positive externalities. And again, the example here would be something like education. If you have more educated individuals in a society, it's not just beneficial for those individuals, but it's beneficial for the society more broadly, because presumably these individuals will be more productive, etc. And in doing so, create more opportunities in society, employment opportunities, etc. So in this case, the initial equilibrium is given by EO, the intersection of the marginal private benefit curve, dP, and the supply curve at a price of PO and QO. But the market doesn't value the consumption of this good, the supply and the demand for this good as highly, perhaps as it should, because it doesn't factor in the external social benefits that are to be gained from consuming more of this good, right? And those benefits are given by the area between the two demand curves, ds and dp. If we look at the social supply curve, if this market did internalize these benefits, then we would notice that the equilibrium supply and price goes up, right? So it would be valued more highly at price H, and more of it would be consumed, right, in the market. This discussion leads us to the notion that to the extent that the private demand and supply will land up here at EO, perhaps there's a role for government to try and nudge this market to get to point E1 somehow, given that there is an external benefit to higher consumption in this market, well, to consumption in general in this market. What are the solutions to these externalities? So we notice in this case that firms are producing too much, and the external costs of the production are not accounted for in the market. And in this case, people are consuming too little of the good. So society is in effect losing out on some external benefit conferred by the consumption of this good. So what are the solutions to these externalities? We can think of 5 such solutions, and we'll just briefly go over each of these. So you can think of Pergoovian taxes and subsidies, direct regulation, Government can create regulated markets. Also, it can support alternative markets, and it can establish appropriate property rights. Pigo is the guy who came up with this idea, which is why it's called Pergoovian taxes and subsidies. These are an attempt to internalize externalities, both the taxes and subsidies. So Pergoovian taxes can be implemented when you have, for instance, a negative production externality, while in the cases where you have a positive demand externality, you can subsidize consumption or production of such a good. And the analytical case for such taxes and subsidies is sound, right? So we went through these markets using the neoclassical tools, analytically introducing taxes, for instance, over here, in this case, and introducing a subsidy over in this case will make sense. And you can imagine that government can introduce a tax equal to EOF, right, in this case, at this point, which would raise the price all the way to G at that level of supply. Point E1, which it turns out is the most efficient equilibrium point here, government can introduce a tax equal to E1J. That internalizes the cost of production in this case. Funds raised by that taxation can then be used to in some way mitigate the negative effects of the production of that good or service, right? But there's one problem with this, which is that government doesn't know this. Government doesn't have this neat demand and supply curve schedules in front of it to say that, the value of the social cost in this industry is equal to JE1. So let's implement a tax equal to JE1, and then the market will be efficient again. There's no sort of explicit, there's no way to estimate these social costs of production, right? In a sort of monetary sense. So the information that's required for the effective implementation of such taxes and subsidies is always lacking. Not often, it's always lacking. All right. So I've got a note here from Uze, who says that the chapter 3 notes, or I guess he means slides, only goes up to 16 and mine goes up to 24. Yes, so I will upload these slides. So I will, yeah. So just look out for that. You will receive a notification when I do that. I'll do it immediately after this. Okay. Now, you can think of one case where you can think of this problem of incomplete information about markets, not only incomplete information about the nature of markets or the status of markets, but also incomplete information about the effects of any action that one takes in these markets. To consider that, you can look at the case of tobacco taxation. So this is usually sort of portrayed as this, this is one of the sin taxes that gets talked about every year in the government's budget, right? Tobacco, alcohol, and so on. So every year the tax goes up on tobacco. I think at this stage it's almost 50% of the cost of tobacco, of a packet of cigarettes. Almost 50% of that goes to due to taxation. And you know, the argument here is that this is the consumption of this good has negative externalities in that it results in people requiring healthcare that is very costly, etc., and it affects the health of people, which makes them less productive. All these you can think of all sorts of externalities associated with consumption of tobacco. So, you know, given our framework that we talked about earlier, you can implement a tax which raises the cost of this product, and in that way, what our analysis says is that you will reduce consumption of the good. You will also raise the price of the good, and that will internalize the costs, right? But of course, that's need not necessarily be the case. In the case of tobacco, we notice that what happens is that it promotes black market activity, right? So people start trading illicit tobacco products, and this is a huge problem. Some people estimate that most of of cigarettes, well, not most, but nearly 50% of cigarettes that are traded in South Africa, that are consumed in South Africa, are traded illegally, right? So first of all, the tax does not get rid of the, and of course people buy these products more cheaply, right? That's why the black market exists, the black market for cigarettes, because you can get it more cheaply than the regulated price. So not only is this the implementation of this tax not getting rid of cheap cigarettes, often these illicit cigarettes are also of lower quality and potentially even more harmful than the cigarettes that you can buy legally. So this is a caveat that one has to bear in mind when it comes to implementing taxes and subsidies to deal with externalities. By the way, these five are listed here as these sort of separate things. All of these can be implemented at the same time, right? They can supplement each other. So now in some cases, and tobacco here is an example, direct regulation is perhaps more appropriate, okay? And we do have regulation on things like cigarette, tobacco sales and so on. So tobacco, it's less easy to buy a packet of cigarettes than to buy other things. Tobacco sales to, I think there's an age restriction of 16. It might have been raised to 18, I'm not sure. But certainly children are not allowed to buy cigarettes as well as alcohol. So that is an example of regulation. And regulation is something that can be used to complement or supplement Pergoovian taxes, right? So not only do you try and rely on the price mechanism to deal with externalities, but you also have, again, this enforcement mechanism of the state, enforcement of regulation, right? So again, government uses its monopoly of violence to curb the sale or the production of goods that it deems as having high social costs, like tobacco. And we observe these regulations in alcohol sales, tobacco sales, gambling, as well as pollution. And in some cases, this is more appropriate, like, for example, tobacco. The idea would just to try and get rid of it, to just say, limit the production of tobacco, for example, or limit the sales of it, or outright ban it. That would be an extreme case. And it's very hard to enforce that. And regulation in general is very difficult in the case of trying to use it to reduce negative externalities, because it's very costly. And it's costly in different ways. One of the things, an example that one can think of is illicit drugs in the US, right? The costs of enforcing the ban on the sale and use of marijuana, or what we call dacha, is extremely high, very high costs, right? Both in terms of the enforcement mechanisms required to implement that prohibition, and also the social costs, and things have turned around there in quite a dramatic way. In the US, in terms of the use of dacha specifically, where many states there are just legalizing it now, and realizing that locking up a lot of people for smoking weed casually is not the best way to go. Doesn't make for a better society necessarily. And some countries take this even further. In places like Switzerland, for example, government actually supplies heroin to people who are addicted to it. And they did that in response to the fact that they had a huge problem with heroin addiction in the 80s and 90s. And they realized that they're not going to control this by just saying, okay, we're banning it, and if we find you, we're going to lock you up. And they realized that rather than doing that, they regulated it in a way that they gave people, they supply people who needed it with doses, and somehow just doing that reduced the problem, reduced the external effects of the problem quite dramatically. Okay, so it can be used to regulation can be used to impose strict enforceable limits on production. And again, this is very difficult. And also, again, is the information problem, right? So there's a lot of, if government imposes a quota, say, on pollution, so any given firm is only allowed to emit X quantity of pollutants into the atmosphere, then this will affect different firms in different ways and could result in inefficiencies, market inefficiencies in the supply of given goods or services. So again, care has to be taken when using this as a mechanism to deal with externalities. Again, the reason is the information asymmetry, or not asymmetry, but the fact that there is incomplete information about, firstly, the nature of the externalities and the true costs of the externalities, as well as the effects of any intervention implemented to deal with these externalities. Okay, another example, another option open to government is to create regulated markets, and the prime example here is a cap and trade scheme, right? In the case of air pollution. So government can just, instead of saying each firm can emit X quantity of pollutants into the atmosphere, government says, in the country as a whole, we are going to allow X quantity of pollutants into the atmosphere. X quantity of carbon emissions, for instance. And then firms can trade the rights to those to emit carbon into the atmosphere, right? So government restricts the overall level of pollution, and then firms can trade the rights to pollute among themselves, right? So the firm who can make the most money from emitting carbon into the atmosphere is going to pay for the right to do so, or is going to pay the highest price in order to do so. Now, in theory, if the cost of pollution, of the pollution permit, the cost of the pollution rights exceeds the cost of pollution reduction, then firms will invest in reducing pollution levels. So in this way, firms are incentivized through this cap and trade scheme. Firms are incentivized to reduce their pollution levels by investing, by developing technologies that make it cheaper to reduce pollution levels versus buying the rights to pollute, right? So it sort of acts in two ways. It limits, firstly, the level of pollution in the economy, this cap and trade scheme, but it also incentivizes firms to invest in technologies that reduce pollution levels, right? But again, this assumes knowledge of optimal pollution levels. So government has to decide on the limit of carbon emissions, right? Again, government doesn't necessarily know what the optimal level of carbon emissions might be. But this has been implemented in some countries, and it also has been implemented in other markets, right? For example, fishing markets. Okay. Then there's the support for alternative markets. And I want to emphasize again that all of these things can be done all at the same time, or at least, yeah, or they can be tried either sequentially or in combination. So support for alternative markets, again, green energy is a prime example here. So government can subsidize the development of these new technologies I mentioned before. So in the previous case, government incentivizes the production of technologies to reduce pollution. Now here, in this case, government can directly subsidize that rather than just incentivizing it through implementing a cap and trade scheme, can actually put money towards the development of new technologies that deal with an externality. So for instance, subsidizing green energy, and this is happening in probably most countries around the world, right? But a good example here would be support for Tesla, the car manufacturer in the States, which is very strangely, bizarrely becoming one of the most valuable companies in the world. So government has directly subsidized Tesla in various ways, has subsidized the development of electric vehicles in the United States. Okay. Then finally, there's the idea of property rights. And all of these are somewhat, have the sort of some controversial aspects to them, have some caveats to them. But this one is perhaps the most controversial. And this is the establishment of property rights. And this idea comes from Coase. Ronald Coase was the guy who promoted this idea, I think in the 60s. And his argument was that there's insufficient, wherever you have externalities, usually it's the case that we have insufficient property rights, which result in external costs. And under well-defined property rights, so if we can define property rights very explicitly, then trade will ensure that all costs are reflected in prices. And this idea addresses externalities through voluntary exchange, and this is why it's appealing to some people, right? Is that you actually you're not appealing in this by appealing to property rights as a response to externalities. You're not necessarily appealing to government to take to play a direct role in markets, right? Rather, you're only requiring government to perform its basic functions, which is to ensure that rights are enforced, to establish rights firstly to individuals and firms, and then secondly to ensure that rights are upheld and enforced. So this addresses externalities through voluntary exchange rather than the need for government for direct intervention through regulation or taxes and so on. Also, it avoids what's appealing is that it, in essence, avoids the knowledge problem, what I've been calling the incomplete information problem. Right? Government doesn't know what an optimal level of carbon emissions is. It doesn't know what the costs are, what the external costs of an activity is, or the external benefits. Right? So, but if you assign people property rights, then you can deal with things through voluntary exchange, and in that way knowledge is generated, right? Knowledge of the true costs of some activity is generated through voluntary exchange. But that again is a very it's a notion that is almost fantastic. Because, and the example given in the textbook here is that if someone wants to, I think the example is that one individual wants to paint their door or their house some garish color, some color that neighbors are not too happy with. If the right to paint her house is explicitly defined, the right for that person to paint their house any color, and similarly the rights of the individuals, of her neighbors, to not have to look at a house that is painted in that color. If those rights are defined, then those parties can then trade on that right? So the neighbors can pay her to not paint her house that way. Likewise, she can pay her neighbors to have them have to look at her house in that color. Or something like that. So this is a very sort of almost utopian idea of dealing with property rights. But I mean, that's a very simple example, but in some examples it does seem to be somewhat plausible. Okay, and Coase argued that, and this argument has spawned quite a literature in the field of public economics. This literature of transaction costs. Coase promoted this idea that one of the reasons that you have externalities is because it doesn't include transaction costs. So the neoclassical framework assumes that everything happens smoothly, instantaneously. When people trade, when people exchange, all rights are defined, everyone knows, everyone has complete information about everything, and transactions happen very smoothly. But of course, that's not true in the real world. There are transactions costs. People don't know the full extent of the nature of a given product that they're purchasing. Producers don't necessarily know the effects of a product once it's sold in the market, and so on. And finding out these things is costly, and that's one example of a transaction cost. And so Coase's idea was that the reason why you have these externalities emerging in the neoclassical framework is because transaction costs are not accounted for explicitly. And once we do that, once we account for transaction costs and implement a sort of extreme version of property rights, then we can deal with externalities purely through market exchange. Okay, so again, very controversial and seemingly fantastic in many instances. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 3